Welcome to It's Your Ego, Stupid, a show lovingly intended for millions of spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect people like you who may at times be led into ego stupidity, a lesser version of yourself and a lesser version of life. This show will give you a much deeper understanding of what ego is, what it's doing to your life, how it can weaken your human and spiritual wellness, and how you can heal in each of these areas if needed. It's Your Ego, Stupid will heighten your awareness of the intense link between your ego and spirit, your humanity and divinity, and the synergy that can lead to the best version of you and your life. Your host is Dr. Nick Martin, a licensed psychologist who has worked in the clinical, university, school, and private practice settings over the past 40 years, while serving as a therapist, diagnostician, educator, and consultant. Welcome again to It's Your Ego, Stupid. And now your host, Dr. Nick Martin.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nick Martin, also known by some as Ego Man, due to my intense focus on ego and how it's impacting our lives, both humanly and spiritually. And I want to thank you for listening to It's Your Ego, Stupid on OMTimes Radio. The title of our show today is Roles People Live, the Sociopath. We're going to be talking about people who are often referred to as sociopaths or psychopaths or antisocial personalities. These are the kind of people who are often pleasant and charming on the outside while having far more devious and destructive intentions below the surface. The kind of people who are very skillful at manipulation, exploitation, and playing upon the emotions of others, when necessary for their own ends. And the kind of people who often bring a lot of pain, misery, and suffering into the lives of the people they touch. There are plenty of people who live in this role because there's no shortage of the supply of the lower ego vulnerability energy that serves to drive people who are living in this role. Today, I'm going to take you inside the sociopath's mind by sharing with you what ego is leading them towards thinking or not thinking, feeling or not feeling, and doing or not doing, and exactly what's happening when a person is living in this role, all in the name of their survival, which is ego's ultimate and only purpose in our life, to be our survival energy. During the show, I'll be focusing on two main areas, ego's voice and spirit's voice. When I talk about ego's voice, I'm talking about that mixture of one's ego energy and one's mind. In the case of today's program, the mixture of the sociopath's lower ego vulnerability energy and their mind. The place where their thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, values, and prejudices are formed and lay the foundation for their personality and sociopathy. It's their lower ego vulnerability energy that's impacting the thoughts and feelings and behaviors that the sociopath forms and uses in their daily life as part of the role that they're living in. Ego doesn't form the thoughts the sociopath is using. The person living in the role of sociopath does, while building on the ego energy at work in their mind. Ego just provides the fuel. And that's an important understanding, that ego is just providing that fuel, that lower ego vulnerability energy is providing the fuel for what occurs in the mind of a person who is living in the role of the sociopath. When our ego is impacting what's going on in the sociopath's mind, they are listening to and speaking with ego's voice, not their own. But they don't know it. And that's why tuning into one's ego energy is one of the three contributors to ego medicine. Because we and the sociopath need to know whose voice we are truly listening to and speaking with in our thoughts, words, and deeds as we go about living our daily lives. Is it ego's voice or is it our voice? Now, we may want to believe it's ours, but don't kid yourself, which is something that's easily done by many. We all need to get the real, truthful, honest, and potentially painful answer to that question. Again, is it ego's voice or mine? And that's what my work is all about, helping you to get that answer and doing something about it if necessary. In a way, finding out if you're living in a role that you didn't realize that you were living in, just as the sociopath is, which is happening for many, whether they're a narcissist or an authoritarian or a cultist, or any of the other roles I'll be talking about in my programs on roles people live. Another way of putting it, the narcissist doesn't know they're a narcissist. The victim doesn't know they're being a victim. And the authoritarian doesn't know they're an authoritarian, because they're unaware of the ego energy operating in their mind and in their life, and that they're living on a 24/7 basis. But they need to find out that so they can be speaking with their voice in their life and not ego's, or they'll just spend their life surviving and never truly living. Now, after I get done talking about ego's voice and what the sociopath needs to hear more about it from during the second segment of our program, I'm going to be sharing with you in the third segment what the sociopath is unable to hear from spirit, due to being kept at a distance from spirit's voice by the ego energy at work, and the distancing effect it has on hearing the voice of spirit. Even though the sociopath has a spiritual core, something that we all have due to being the love, life, and energy God is, they are not spiritually well, because they can't be spiritually well in their life due to what their ego energy is doing in it. Their unhealthy, lower ego vulnerability energy is not allowing them to hear about and be the love, life, and energy God is within their daily thoughts, words, and deeds. And sadly, Spirit's voice is something they may never hear and come to know unless they heal their ego energy. And sadly, the ego energy of the sociopath is getting in the way of connecting to their divinity, of being able to be their divinity in their daily life. And sadly, this is something that happens to many people in their lives, whatever role they're living in. Many people die living in the role they had been living for 30, 40, or 50 years of their life. They never get better, and they died never having really lived, because they spent all their time surviving. With those sobering thoughts, I'll get started looking deeply into the sociopath by first giving you a brief description of the role of the sociopath. This can be a person you may or may not be acquainted with in your personal life, but is out there in society, if not in your home, so that we can kind of be on the same page as to the role and the kind of person I'm talking about. So, my description of the sociopath has something to do with understanding that the sociopath has developed a complete disregard for the welfare and rights of others. The sociopath could care less about the needs, the desires, the welfare of other people. And this lack of interest, this disregard, is rooted in the nature of the lower ego vulnerability energy. This is an energy that is unable to recognize the needs of others, the feelings of others. The sociopath operates without feelings. They're emotionally isolated. They're emotionally distant, and it prevents them from being able to register just how other people are feeling so that they can feel no empathy for others or guilt for what they have done to bring harm or pain to others. Empathy is something that we feel for other people, to understand their experience, to tune into their experiences and how it's affecting them. And this is something that the sociopath lacks an ability to do because of the nature of their lower ego vulnerability energy that is preventing them from being able to experience this. And that they can also have no ability, or they have no ability, to experience guilt, an important emotion that all of us need to experience to sort of guide us and to help us temper our actions and behaviors so that they are in alignment with what other people's needs are and not just our own. But unfortunately for the sociopath, the lower ego vulnerability energy and that, again, emotional distance, that emotional isolation stands in the way of their being able to experience the healthy guilt that we all can feel and need to feel at the right times and in the right places in our life. They often have an enjoyment of causing harm or pain to others. Now, that may seem rather unusual, and obviously it sounds kind of crazy or wacky or certainly abnormal. And that's because a lot of times when a person who is a sociopath or who has lower ego vulnerability, due to their inability to feel emotions under normal circumstances, may often instigate situations, create drama, or situations that bring harm or pain to others for their own personal enjoyment. It's as if they are able to experience emotions under their terms, not life's terms, their terms. So creating harm or pain or discomfort creates an enjoyment, an arousal, a stimulation for the sociopath that they can get off on. As I say in my work, these can be the only opportunities that they might feel the emotions of anger or fear, which again are pleasurable. When you think about anger and fear and anxiety and guilt, those kinds of feelings we typically feel with ego energy that's in a balanced place are experienced as unpleasurable. But for the sociopath, those are often experienced as desirable, pleasurable, because they trigger some of the emotional, the physiological arousal and stimulation and enjoyment that they are unable to experience under normal terms. Also, if the sociopath has a history of being abused, they can often work to become the victimizer so they will no longer be the victim. Again, if their histories, and many people who are sociopaths have histories of having been abused, having been victimized. It could be physical, it can be emotional, mental, or sexual. And the role of the victimizer, or the experience of the victimizer, is an experience that certainly is unpleasant. And so in response to that, the ego energy, the lower ego vulnerability energy, often leads them in the direction of becoming the victimizer or the predator, the person who is no longer the victim if they can become the victimizer. And this makes me think a little bit about people who have histories of sexual abuse who go on to be people who sexually abuse of others. It's as if their experience of having been victimized earlier in their life by people who were sexual predators has led them in the direction of being able to end that victim status by becoming a victimizer, a sexual predator. And this is where the ego energy is in some odd way promoting survival. Survival in the sense that one stops being the victim and one starts being the victimizer. Again, this is what the ego energy is about, to promote survival in its efforts to help us live Unfortunately, when our ego energy is out of balance or imbalanced, as I refer to it, and the more imbalanced it is, we start getting heavily into surviving, even in the craziest and oddest and most abnormal of ways, and we stop living. And so for some people who are sociopaths, victimization of others is a form of empowerment. They can feel empowered as a result of becoming the predator or the victimizer or the abuser, because it ends the opposing situation of being the person who was the victim. So this is an overview, a description of the experiences of what the sociopath has been is about, and we're going to talk more when we go after we come away from our first segment about the ego's voice and what ego is saying that is needing to be heard by the person who is living in the role of the sociopath. Coming up on our first break, again, we'll be looking at what the person living in the role of the sociopath needs to hear and recognize from the voice of ego that is shaping the way they think, feel, and behave. This is Dr. Nick. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, and I'll see you after the break.
Conscious media for conscious minds. OMTimes. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio, and we'll explore these topics and so much more on Destination Unlimited.
Hi, Dr. Nick Martin here. I want to invite you to visit my website, egoandspirit.info, where you can find lots of information on ego and download your free ebook copy of It's Your Ego Stupid. Fix it to fix your life. Also, please visit the shop page where you can find each of my other books, Ego Therapy, Ego Spiritualism, and The Two Voices Within.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, a show for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people, just like you and me. Now we're going to take a look at the voice of ego operating in the mind of the sociopath. These are the kinds of thoughts rooted in lower ego vulnerability energy the sociopath is using to survive in their life, and will serve as the foundation for the thinking, feeling, and behaving they make use of as they go about their daily life. These are the kinds of thoughts they must come to hear, recognize, and change if they are ever to become a better person, a whole person, and someone who can be their humanity and divinity. So we begin with ego's voice. Ego's voice says, "You have been led to live without emotion, so you will know no weakness within yourself. Emotion is your enemy, and you must keep it at great distance. It can only remind you of your weakness." So ego is saying that emotion is an enemy, to keep it at a distance, that it can only remind you of your weakness. Here the sociopath is teaching themselves with the assistance of their lower ego vulnerability energy that their emotions can serve as a doorway to making contact with one's weaknesses and humanity. That emotions are like a conduit, a connecting point to getting in touch with one's weaknesses and humanity, and that this is really something to be avoided at all costs. Something that the sociopath, building on the energy in their mind, the lower ego vulnerability energy, is making use of to teach themselves and to live this distance, this disconnection from emotion. They teach themselves that emotions are a bad thing. So whether it's love or anxiety or sadness or anger, the message they receive or giving to themselves as a result of that combination of ego energy and their own mind is that the emotions are a bad thing. For the sociopath, being out of contact with feelings and emotions makes their weaknesses, imperfections, and humanity non-existent. You think about that. If we don't have feelings to bring us into touch with what we're doing or not doing, whether it's anxiety or fear or guilt, it makes it much easier to not come to terms with and recognize one's weaknesses and imperfections and humanity, which is exactly what's going on for the sociopath. It makes them feel less vulnerable and preferably invulnerable, which is just the way they want to be. Ego's voice says fear, guilt, and love must remain strangers to you. The absence of your emotion has made you invulnerable and allows you to enjoy the power and strength of your isolation. Isolation from emotion is your oxygen, and you must have it, because this is where you are safest and can survive best. Again, ego's message, ego's voice is talking about emotions, including the fear, guilt, and love that most of us experience in their proper amounts when necessary, but to keep them at a distance, to not be in contact with them, to not experience them, and that this will create a sense of enhanced invulnerability by being disconnected from them. As I said earlier, the lack of contact with one's humanity, one's imperfections, and one's weaknesses made easier when emotion is not part of who you are when you're functioning. Here the sociopath is teaching themselves with the assistance of their lower ego vulnerability energy to disown feelings. They are learning to associate an absence of emotion with the absence of being vulnerable. So no emotionality, no recognition, no expression, at least on a healthy level, is equated with being invulnerable or being less vulnerable. And that survival is best ensured in the absence of emotion. Here again is the survival emphasis of ego energy to promote survival. In the case of the sociopath, the survival is ensured within the absence of emotion. So not feeling love or not feeling guilt particularly is going to enhance one's survival in the experience of the sociopath. This is, again, a reflection of the exaggeration that happens when ego energy is very imbalanced, which is the case for the sociopath and all of the other roles I'll be talking about. And I do talk about that when our ego energy is very low or very high. In the case of the sociopath, it's very low. There's a lot of exaggeration in the need to survive, and survival is the emphasis, and people stop living. I refer to a volume level of 0-1 on the scale for ego vulnerability that I've discussed in my previous show looking at ego volume. Ego's voice says you must trust no one, as trusting others would invite weakness. Trust is an enemy built upon feelings, which will lead you to weakness. Emotion can only blind you and lead you into betrayal by others. So here, ego's voice is sending a strong message built upon the ego energy within the sociopath, having to do with trust. And that trust is a bad thing. It invites weakness. And trust is something that's connected to one's feelings. So if you don't feel, then you don't have to risk trusting others. Here the sociopath is teaching themselves with the assistance of their lower vulnerability energy, again, that trust is a very bad thing, that they can't trust anyone, only themselves. Anyone means they can't trust family, they can't trust their spouse or partner or children or parents or friends or so-called friends, and that the only person that they are to trust is themselves. That trust will make them vulnerable, and that's to be avoided by the sociopath at all cost. So sociopaths are often untrusting, very untrusting, and this is coming from the vulnerability that's often linked to trust, because it is when we are in relationships and we must trust, sometimes that trust can be misplaced and we can get hurt, but one can't really have a relationship in the absence of trust. You can pretend to have one, but in reality you often don't. Also, trust threatens one's survival, and their lower ego vulnerability energy is working overtime to make sure that doesn't happen, which is its main job, its reason to be, the sociopath survival. And I've said this previously, how central, how important survival is with regard to ego and the energy that it is. And so in the sociopath, that ego energy is operating very intensely to help them think about trust as something not to be done. And it's leading the sociopath to stay away from emotions, particularly love, because trust begins with and is rooted in feelings, and particularly love. If you don't trust or if you don't feel love, it's hard to experience trust for oneself and for others. Ego's voice says, remain vigilant for those who may deceive you with manipulation and exploitation, and destroy those who would seek to make you weak. Do not seek to know their feelings, as this would only weaken you. This would only weaken you to know their feelings. Here the sociopath is teaching themselves, again with the assistance of their lower ego vulnerability energy, to treat all as untrustworthy. To treat all as untrustworthy. That all will eventually get around to harming you or harming them, the sociopath, with deception, manipulation, and exploitation. So in a way, to be 2 steps ahead in the game by removing any threats to their financial or work or relationship situations. These are kind of daily survival related contexts. In some cases, to be cold-blooded, if necessary, to deal with these threats so they don't return and threaten your invulnerability. Also, that showing concern for the feelings of others, empathy or compassion, opens the door to becoming vulnerable, which is something, again, the sociopath is trying to keep themselves at a distance from by not experiencing feelings or empathy or compassion. In a way, don't get to know the humanity of others, so you won't have to get to know your own, in all of the weaknesses and imperfections that come with it. So in a way, when we get to know other people, we get to know who they are and experience feelings with them and for them. It's a way of coming to know not only their humanity, but our humanity. In the case, the sociopath does not want to get to know a humanity they possess, which contains imperfections and weaknesses and vulnerability. Ego's voice says, compassion and connection to others through emotion can only weaken you. Compassion and connection to others through emotion can only weaken you. You must keep others at a distance, so you will not see your weaknesses within them. Remain separate in your isolation, and you will be kept safe. Here the sociopath is teaching themselves with the assistance of their lower ego vulnerability energy about the dangers of compassion, of empathy, and love, and to not allow emotions and empathy to serve as mirrors or serve as a mirror to parts of themselves they want to remain hidden, mainly their inherent human vulnerability. So feelings and empathy towards others, sometimes we can see our lives, we can see ourselves, we can see our imperfections and our weaknesses in others. And this is something that the sociopath does not want to occur. So the combination of their lower ego vulnerability energy with their mind is leading to the desire to create those distances from emotion and empathy and compassion. To make use more so of emotional alienation from oneself, out of touch with your own feelings and emotions, as well as others, to allow for emotional detachment within any relationship and emotional isolation as a means to ensuring one's safety and survival. Ego's voice says, call upon your emotion to create distance from others. Let it create thoughts, words, and deeds of anger and fear for this purpose. Enjoy the anger you have aroused within yourself and the fear you have stirred in others. Enjoy the distance from weakness that comes from within and without when using anger and fear wherever and whenever it suits you. They are a tool separating you from the weak, the unworthy, and the unequal, who are your enemies. These enemies affirm your isolation, invulnerability, and separation from weakness. Remaining separated from them through anger and fear keeps you safest and lets you survive well. Here the sociopath is teaching themselves with the assistance of their lower vulnerability energy to use emotion as a tool to enhance their safety and survival, to use anger and fear when necessary to build a wall of isolation and distance from others, to recognize fear of them, meaning the sociopath, by others, to be embraced as a reflection of their invulnerability, to experience a sense of invulnerability as a result of others fearing them, and to enjoy the fear others have of them. That emotions are to be used on their terms, not life's terms, and whether it involves purposefully instigating guilt in others through manipulation, or perhaps feigning love or guilt for purposes of manipulation of others on the part of the sociopath, or perhaps fostering anger within others for the purpose of their enjoyment. That their survival is best assured when having this contrived relationship with feelings and emotions. Again, a contrived relationships, not life emotions on one's terms, not on life's terms, but on one's own terms. We're coming up on our second break. When we return, we'll be looking at what the person living in the role of the sociopath is unable to hear from the voice of spirit due to the unhealthy, imbalanced ego energy that is at work. This is Dr. Nick. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, and I'll see you after the break.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
If I could be you,
and you could be me,
for just 1 hour.
If you could find a way
to get inside
each other's mind.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
We've all felt left out. And for some, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Welcome back. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, a show for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people, just like you and me. Now I'm going to be looking at what the voice of spirit is saying to the sociopath that they're unable to hear due to the blockage being caused by their lower ego vulnerability energy and the distance from their divinity that results from the thoughts and messages contained within ego's voice that I shared with you earlier. Along with coming to recognize ego's voice using ego medicine, the sociopath will need to hear the voice of spirit in order to fully heal and bring about the synergy, the merging, the unification of their humanity and divinity. So now we're going to take a look at Spirit's voice. Spirit's voice says, the distance you keep from your emotion is weakness, not strength. Living a fearless, guiltless, or loveless existence does not make you invulnerable, as you remain an imperfect earthly being. The fear of your emotion has made you weak, not your weaknesses themselves. Spirit's voice is saying that keeping distance from one's emotions is not good, not healthy. It's a weakness, unlike what ego and lower ego vulnerability energy is leading the sociopath to think, that being alienated emotionally from oneself as well as others, being distant emotionally, is actually a very big weakness, unlike the strength of coming to know, recognize, acknowledge, and express the feelings that we all have as part of being a human being. And so the absence of fear, the absence of guilt, the absence of love is not really the making of invulnerability, unlike what the voice of ego is suggesting, that those kinds of emotions are the making, or the absence of those emotions are the making of invulnerability, which is not truly the case. And as Spirit is saying, that we all remain imperfect earthly human beings from the beginning to the end of our lives. Our perfection doesn't reside in our humanity, but in our divinity. And so Spirit is saying that fearfulness of one's emotions is really a source of weakness. Keeping at a distance and failing to recognize and experience feelings of guilt or love or fear or even anger are actually weaknesses, as opposed to being able to experience them and work with them and use them in one's life. Spirit's voice says, your isolation will not fix this weakness. Isolation will only blind you to your weaknesses, divine truth, and the divine gifts that you have been given. The love, life, and energy God is remains unknown to you within your emotional isolation. You cannot welcome the divine truth within yourself and in all that surrounds you when you isolate yourself from others. So, Spirit is, again, talking about emotional isolation and being emotionally isolated from others or from oneself, being in a place of being unable or unwilling to come to know one's feelings and emotions is not a source of strength, but again, weakness. And that this emotional isolation is only going to serve to hide you from those weaknesses that truly exist. And those are okay to get to know and understand and to work with, rather than trying to keep one's distance from and never know. Being able to understand the love, life, and energy God is within oneself will not occur if one does not have contact with their feelings. Coming to know the unconditional, unburdened, connective, and unlimited love God is within one's being is made possible when we work with and come to experience our emotions. Being able to recognize the presence of life and all that exists within oneself and around us, and being able to honor and respect all of that life. Again, made possible through one's feelings, whether they are feelings of love or feelings of fear or guilt. They open that door to knowing the life that God is. And that we cannot welcome the divinity within our humanity in the absence of emotion, and being able to recognize its existence and presence in all that surrounds us. Does not happen as a result of being emotionally isolated. So the egoic messages that suggest that being emotionally isolated is a good thing, a strong thing, is not in keeping with that ability to come to know the divinity within our humanity. Spirit's voice says one cannot truly know a meaningful and purposeful life in the absence of emotion, and one cannot create life with destructive words, thoughts, and deeds. One cannot know eternal life when consumed with earthly life, or know the God within if one does not seek God. Your isolation from these gifts that you have been given is a reflection of your suffering. Spirit is telling the sociopath that meaningfulness and purposefulness in one's life cannot truly happen in the absence of feelings and emotion, and that one cannot create life. One of the great gifts that we all received is the ability to create the life in which we are living. But that creation requires things that are constructive, positive, in fact, loving words, thoughts, and deeds that adore to creating the life in which we are living, which is a meaningful and full life. That eternal life, one of the four great gifts that we've all been given, the divine gifts, the eternal life that we have cannot be known if we are consumed with our earthly survival, which is what the sociopath is experiencing. They're consumption, whether they know it or not, is with their survival and how to survive, keeping a distance from one's weaknesses or one's emotions is the game plan that the egoic voice is leading the sociopath to take on. And that the isolation from the gifts that we've all been given is a reflection of your suffering. That's a pretty important message, that when we gain distance from our humanity and we become inhumane, as is the case for the sociopath and many of the roles that I'll be talking about, we start to suffer. We may suffer in very subtle ways, or we may suffer in very dramatic and very noticeable ways to ourselves. And the same with gaining distance from our divinity, gaining distance from being the love, life, and energy that God is in our being. That's suffering. When we fail to receive the divine gifts that we've been given in a whole way, knowing the gift of our life, knowing the gift of being able to create the life in which we're living, knowing the gift of eternal life and the gift of God within. All of those, when we fail to know them and understand and welcome them, to receive them and work with them in our lives, are reflective of suffering. Spirit's voice says you have made enemies of your neighbors and friends through the illusions of separation, unworthiness, and inequality you have created within your isolation. These illusions are born of fear, are your true enemies, not those who surround you. These enemies lurk within, not without. So Spirit is talking about the enemies. Sociopaths frequently look upon people in their lives as enemies, as threats to them, and that's why they try to keep them at a distance. And some of the distance is the need for separation, to be disconnected, to perhaps see those as being less worthy than oneself or unequal to oneself. These are illusions. These are egoic illusions I talk about in my book, Ego Spiritualism, that are often fostered by the nature of the ego energy we are living. And that these illusions, born of fear, they're fear-based illusions. They're not love-based illusions, but that they're fear-based illusions that are one's enemies. The true enemy, oftentimes the enemy within, often our greatest enemy, a person's greatest enemy, the person who gets in their way the most, is oneself. And this is the case for the sociopath. They are making enemies of people on the outside, when in actuality, their great enemy, their true enemy, is themselves. Spirit's voice says the strongest are those who can love everyone despite their own weaknesses and those of their neighbors. Love is a far greater force that resides within you. Strength and invulnerability do not reside in destruction, but in love. So love your neighbor and yourself. Spirit is talking about real strength, true strength, the strength of unconditional, connective, unlimited, and unburdened love for all, oneself as well as our neighbors. And that this strength is far greater than any other strength rooted in anger or fear that often is in the realm of people who are living in a sociopathic existence. And that our strength and our invulnerability do not reside in our being destructive, but in love. The invulnerability in a way of God's love and being God's love is part of the message that Spirit is sending to the sociopath. Spirit's voice says your emotion has become a tool for the destruction of others and yourself. This emotion lies hidden within thoughts and words and deeds of anger and fear, reflections of your weakness and suffering that are leading you further into darkness. You cannot escape these weaknesses through isolation, destruction, and the illusion of invulnerability. So our Spirit is telling us that emotion is being used in some cases by the sociopath as a tool, in a way working with emotion on their terms, the sociopath's terms, rather than on life's terms. And so doing things that make use of anger or fear in one's dealings with others, to instill it in others or in oneself, is a means by which there is this distorted, negative, ugly a way of dealing with emotion that's playing out for the sociopath. And that this is being reflected not always in the open feelings that one can see in them, but in their thoughts and their words and their behaviors of anger and fear. So in many cases, the sociopath is a very angry person. And Spirit is saying that our weaknesses, the sociopath's weaknesses, cannot be removed through isolation, destruction, or this pretension of invulnerability built upon being isolated and at a distance from others. Finally, Spirit's voice says, God's presence within your being ensures that this cannot occur. Awakening to your divine truth will deliver you from the depth of your isolation and destruction. A deliverance into the kingdom of heaven that is meant for you and all beings. What Spirit is saying, that despite all of the things that are going on with one's humanity or inhumanity playing out in the sociopath, that God's presence within ensures that we can't escape those weaknesses that we have, or that the sociopath is experiencing in their life. And that the presence of God, particularly the divine truth of love, life, and energy that God is in one's existence, in one's being, will always be with us, with anyone, including the sociopath, even though they're out of contact with their divinity. And that awakening to this will help to remove them from the depth and isolation that comes with living in an existence that overlooks or ignores the imperfections of one's humanity. And that it is possible to enter into the kingdom of heaven that is meant for all, including the sociopath, and to do so now in the earthly realm, not after one leaves this earthly world. We're coming to the end of today's program. I hope what I've shared will allow those needing to do so to hear the voices of ego and spirit that must be heard, so that they can truly speak with more of their voice in their life and not ego's, and get on with the business of truly living and not just surviving. I want to mention that you can purchase each of my books, Ego Therapy, Ego Spiritualism, The Two Voices Within, and It's Your Ego Stupid at the online bookstores for Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Balboa Press. You can also purchase focused ego meditations on the shop page of my website, egoandspirit.info, which can help you to know when you are truly speaking with your voice in your life and not ego's, as you go about healing your ego energy where needed in its power, flexibility, or vulnerability. I end today's show with this message. The great news is that working to heal your ego energy using ego medicine By growing your awareness of its symptoms, ego stupidity, insights, and spiritual impact, will allow the divine truth in your being to flow and shine through you, and allow you to fully embrace each of the divine gifts. The spiritual part of healing is a given. It's part of your endowment. Divine truth and the divine gifts are part of your heritage that already exists within you. You need do nothing more to be spiritual because you already are. You are a spiritual being having a human experience. You only need to enhance your humanity with ego medicine so that all which is available to you is given. Fix your ego to fix your life, humanly and spiritually. Thank you for listening and allowing me to be your servant. Please have a great week, and do come back to my next program. In peace and love, this is Dr. Nick saying goodbye for now.